Senator Rubio.
Thank you. You outlined in your statement that there are 4 strategic priorities in the hemisphere. The first being, and I'm glad to see the first being, effective institutions for democratic governance. So on the issue of Cuba, my hope, and I think the answer is yes, that our real goal there is to ultimately have Cuba become a democracy, a functional democracy with institutions where people get to. So our policies towards Cuba should be geared towards accomplishing that. And the administration has made a decision that one of the ways it wants to do that is it wants to allow Americans, both Cuban Americans traveling back to see families, but Americans through academic institutions, church-based groups, and others travel to Cuba under the notion that access to Americans will somehow provide information to the average Cuban and therefore further the cause of ultimately creating some sort of political opening and a democracy. Is that an accurate reflection of our goals as a result of the?
I think that's correct. We believe that that kind of purposeful travel is in aid of what we completely agree on, which is a free and open Cuba.
But as you've conceded today, there's a cost-benefit analysis. We understand that the cost of doing that is that it provides hard currency to the regime. The regime uses that hard currency not just to further their own economic interests as individuals, but also to fund the repressive arm of the government. We know that political repression has increased. We know that there's been an emerging resistance. It's no longer just human rights activists or dissidents. There's an open resistance in Cuba now, a resistance which is being oppressed by political police, basically, and they're funded. And I don't think anyone would argue that some of the funding for that comes from the hard currency that they now have access to as a result of this increased travel. That's the cost of doing that, which you've conceded. In exchange, though, the benefit, the administration's position is that the benefit of having Americans travel to Cuba outweigh the hard currency that's now available to the Castro regime as a result of this travel. Is that right?
Certain very clearly defined travel, yes.
So, for example, what specific groups have traveled to Cuba, say, in the last year that we think have helped further the cause of democracy? For example, what particular trips or actual missions to Cuba can we point to that, for example, have met with some of these resistant leaders or have deliverables in terms of actually making progress? I'm looking for signs that somehow this travel has led to advances that we can point to and say this is something that's contributing towards the democracy being closer for the Cuban people. Do we have any groups like that? Do we have any specific travel like that we think has made that kind of progress?
Senator, I would have to take a look at which specific groups have gone to Cuba very recently. I know that since the regulatory changes were made at the end of January, and it took us a while to get specific guidelines in place, and obviously groups are beginning to apply, it's my understanding that there have not been a huge number of groups that have gone under the new regulations, but obviously I'll take that back to look at specifically what organizations. But we do know that some church organizations and religious groups are interested in doing missions, humanitarian work, as well as academics who would like to travel to Cuba.
But if our policy ultimately is to foster democracy, shouldn't these groups be evaluated on the basis of what they would do to foster democracy? If a ballet wants to go perform in Cuba, if a sports team wants to go play, shouldn't we analyze that at least to try to figure out, well, what does this do to help foster democracy? Who are you going to get to see? Where are you going to get to express yourself? What are you going to do when you're there that actually fosters our foreign policy towards Cuba, which is the hope of a creation of the underpinnings for a democratic transition?
Right. Well, certainly, Senator, I think that the goal in any of these groups going to Cuba is to expose average Cubans to as much about the United States and its culture, its efforts to assist them individually without the intervention of the Cuban government as possible. And that may take various forms in the travel of groups that go to Cuba, and hopefully all of that would aid in getting information, culture, educational materials to the people of Cuba.
But again, and I understand that's the theory behind it, but I would just advocate that if indeed we're going to allow people to travel to Cuba, and our hope is that somehow this travel to Cuba will help foster democracy, that somehow there be a nexus established between the troop that they're taking, because we already have conceded that every time they go over there, they're turning hard currency over to a repressive regime. So we've already conceded, the administration has, that there's a price to be paid, that we recognize that these trips are providing hard currency for a repressive regime. So if we should at least try to, in each one of these trips, establish that at a minimum, the cost that we're paying by allowing this money to be available to the repressive regime is offset by the benefit of that specific trip. And I would hope that we would establish a policy that clearly creates a nexus between the trips and our foreign policy towards the island, which is the hope of advancing democracy. I think that my hope would be that if in fact people are going to travel there and organizations are going to travel there, that they could somehow show us how they're traveling there, in addition to filling some curiosity, is going to actually provide some assistance that will contribute towards the creation of democracy in Cuba. That would be and my other concern is that Alan Gross was on the island for the purpose of fostering access to information. And so I'm really concerned about that, because it shows that there are limits. In fact, it proves that there is limits as to what the Cuban regime is going to tolerate in terms of trip. In essence, they're not going to allow people into the island that they think are going to undermine their standing. It appears to me that they have a filter process in place where they're going to deny access. And that's the other part of this equation that I think has been forgotten. Not anyone can just travel to Cuba. If tomorrow someone announced they want to travel to Cuba for the purpose of meeting with 5 of the leading resistance members, you're not going to get in. They're only going to allow in those people that they think do not undermine their activities. And we now have evidence of an American citizen that they believed undermined them, and the result, he's now sitting in jail. I think that has to be a major concern as well, because even though on this side of the equation things may be very well intentioned, we can't forget that the other side of the equation is the Cuban regime. And the Cuban regime is not going to openly allow people to come into Cuba that are somehow going to undermine them. They're going to select and only allow those in that they think don't undermine them. Isn't that something we're concerned about?
That's certainly something that we are concerned about. We're concerned about it, for example, in the democracy programs that we have, which are designed in our foreign assistance programs, are designed to increase contact or promote information in Cuba. We certainly make clear to all Americans going to Cuba in all of our public information what the circumstances are in Cuba and the risks they may be taking by traveling.
So we make clear to people who are traveling to Cuba for people-to-people contact, we make clear to them that if they go too far in advocating for democracy or regime change, that they could go to jail?
I think we have a balance and a responsibility to American citizens to be clear on what the circumstances are in Cuba and what the circumstances of others have been.
And I think that's the right thing to do, to warn them. But my point is that if we tell people, hey, if you go to Cuba and you speak out in favor of democracy and against a regime, you may go to jail. So really the only safe way to go to Cuba is to travel there and not really do anything more than, cultural stuff, but really don't talk about politics, because that could get you in trouble. I mean, doesn't that defeat the purpose of the people-to-people contact that we're trying to, if indeed the purpose of people-to-people contact is to further democracy?
I think, Senator, that we would probably agree that there are lots of different ways we can help the Cuban people determine their own future. And we're going to use all of the tools that we can to try and give Cubans a larger aperture on the world that helps enable them to determine their own future, in particular politically.
Okay, my last question. There was press reports recently about a trip taken by Governor Richardson to Cuba, and in that press report it claimed that the United States had made some sort of unilateral offers to Cuba in exchange for the release of Alan Gross, that we'd offered to, walk away from democracy programs, that there had been offers. Hey, could you comment on that? Did that happen? Has the United States been involved in any unilateral type negotiations promising changes in Cuba policy in exchange for the release of Mr. Gross?
Senator, we have never offered unilateral concessions to the Cuban government in exchange for Mr. Gross. As badly as we would like Mr. Gross returned home, that should be unconditional so he can be with his family. Governor Richardson traveled to Cuba as a private citizen, and he was not authorized to present any proposals on behalf of the U.S. government.
So just to be clear, we have never offered changes in Cuba policy in exchange for the release of Mr. Gross?
That is correct. We have not.
Thank you.